The smoke had not yet left Eleanor Vane's hair when she sat down to her first breakfast as Duchess of Aldermere, and she would remember for the rest of her life that nobody at the table knew what to call her. The chapel of St. Ione's had burned to its bones the night before, candle or lightning, nobody could say which, and the marriage that had been spoken inside it not 2 hours before the fire took hold was now the only proof of itself left standing. The room smelled of cold toast and hot silver, and, underneath both, of smoke that had followed her in on her own skin, and would not be washed out for a week. A footman set down her cup a half-second after he ought to have, glanced at the empty chair where the dowager usually sat, and could not decide, plainly, whether the woman opposite the Duke was to be served first, or last, or at all. And in that half-second of his hesitation, Eleanor understood the whole of the next year of her life. She reached into the pocket of her borrowed grey dress, because her own clothes had gone into the fire with everything else she owned that was not already on her body, and closed her hand around the one thing that had survived with her. It was a sliver of bone no longer than her thumb, worn to the colour of an old tooth, flattened along one edge from 40 years of creasing paper true, and scratched along its spine with a single letter, H. Cut by a boy's unsteady knife the year her father had been given it by his own father, and given by him to her the year she turned 9, and could first hold a blade steady. A bone folder. Bookbinder's tool. Worth, in any shop in London, perhaps 3d. She turned it once between finger and thumb under the table, the way she had turned it every day of her life since, and did not look up from her plate, because looking up meant meeting the footman's eyes and admitting that neither of them knew what she was. Julian was already gone from the table, had been gone since before light, out at the black ruin of the chapel with the sexton, and 2 men from the village trying to learn whether the register book had gone with everything else. She had asked him, the night before, straight out, whether it mattered so very much, one book, when the words had already been said and heard, and could not be unsaid. He had turned the ring on his smallest finger, the old signet with the running hair on it, a full turn, and back. The way she had already learned he did, when he was about to give her less than the whole truth. It matters to other people, he'd said, not to us. She had not believed the second half of that sentence even as he said it, and she believed it less now, alone at his breakfast table with a burned chapel 2 miles off, and a bone folder warm in her fist. Her father had raised her in a bindery on Cutler's Row, a narrow shop that smelled always of hide glue and beeswax and the particular sweetish rot of old vellum going soft, and he had taught her, before he taught her her letters properly, that a book was only ever as strong as its spine, and a spine was only ever as strong as what you sewed into it when nobody was looking. She had not expected to marry a duke. She had not, if she was honest with the bone folder and nobody else, ever much wanted to. She had wanted the shop, and her father's trade, and perhaps in time Aaron Fenwick's steady, unremarkable devotion, which asked nothing of her she did not already have to give. What she had gotten instead was a burning building, a hurried vow before a dying old vicar, and a breakfast table where a footman did not know whether to call her Your Grace, or nothing at all. She ate her toast cold. She did not ask twice. And when, 3 days later, a letter came up from the bishop's palace at Ray, addressed with careful formality to Her Grace, the Duchess of Aldermere, the first letter in her whole life to name her so, she read it twice before she let herself believe the ink, and then she went down to find her father, because whatever the letter meant, it meant the world she had married into had finally noticed she was standing in it. The road to Aldermere proper ran 2 hours by chaise from the Dower House, where Eleanor had spent the first weeks of her marriage half hidden, half healing, and she watched the country change through the glass the way she had once watched a book change under her hands, page by page, each one committing her a little further to what was written. The house itself arrived before she was ready for it, a long grey front the colour of a winter sky, windows enough to count in dozens, and the smell that met her stepping down was not smoke this time, but box hedge and horse, and, very faintly, the river that ran along the east lawn, cold and mineral. She counted 4 sensory things before she had crossed the gravel, and she counted them the way her father had taught her to count stitches, because counting steadied the hands. Julian met her on the steps himself, which she would later understand was already an announcement. Dukes did not commonly meet their own carriages, and his hand found the small of her back for exactly as long as propriety allowed, and not 1 second longer. Inside, the hall was full of people she had not met, gathered with the particular idleness of those who have arranged to look as though they were not waiting for anyone. The Dowager Duchess, Julian's grandmother, sat in the one chair in the room that might have been called a throne without much exaggeration, and looked at Eleanor for the length of time it takes to read a short paragraph, and said nothing at all, which Eleanor understood immediately to be the worst thing the old woman could have done. It was the cousin who came forward first. Edmund Vane was, by every visible measure, an easy man to like, tall and unhurried and dressed with the kind of carelessness that costs a great deal of money to achieve, and he took Eleanor's hand and bowed over it with a smile that reached his mouth a half-second before it troubled his eyes at all. "Cousin," he said warmly, as though the word cost him nothing, though she would learn it cost him everything. "We have all been so very curious to meet the woman who managed what none of the rest of us could, marrying Julian before his grandmother had time to object." There was laughter at that. Careful laughter. Testing laughter. And Eleanor smiled because the alternative was worse, and said that she supposed a burning building left little time for anyone's objections, which was true, and which also, she saw from the small flicker behind Edmund's eyes, was not the answer he had expected from a bookbinder's daughter. He recovered instantly. "A fire," he said, "is a terrible thing to lose a wedding to, or gain one from, depending how you tell it." It was the Dowager who spoke next, and her voice was the kind that did not need raising, because a lifetime of not raising it had taught every room to lean toward her instead. "And which register," she asked, of no one in particular, "has Reverend Combs' clerk found among the ashes, that we might know precisely how married my grandson is?" Nobody answered her, because nobody yet knew, and the silence that followed had teeth in it. Eleanor felt Julian's hand find the small of her back again, longer this time, and understood that he had heard the teeth too. Later that evening, when the house had settled into its separate rooms and separate silences, she found the long gallery at the west end, more by accident than plan, and stood at the window, because a plain grey window asks nothing of a person the way a room full of relations does. From there she could see, small and black against the dusk, the ruined spire of St. Ione's still standing, though everything beneath it had gone, a burnt finger pointed at a sky it no longer had any business addressing. She stood a long while. Behind her, a voice she had not yet learned to place said that it was considered bad luck in this county to look too long at a burned church after dark, and she turned to find Edmund leaning in the doorway with 2 glasses of something amber, one of which he held out to her as though it were the most natural courtesy in the world. She did not take it at once. "I did not think Duke's cousins believed in luck," she said. "Only the bad kind," he said, The good kind requires too much faith. He came to stand beside her at the glass, not too close, exactly close enough, and looked out at the spire with her. "It is a strange thing," he said, "to watch a man marry in the space of an afternoon a woman his family has never heard of, in a building that no longer exists, before a priest who died the same week. I don't say it against you. I only say it is strange, and strange things want looking into, for everyone's comfort, yours most of all." She took the glass from him then, because refusing it a second time would have told him more than accepting it, and said that she had found, in her experience, that things which wanted looking into on other people's behalf were usually things that wanted looking into on someone else's behalf entirely. He laughed at that, a real laugh, and she understood, standing at the window with the dead spire between them, that she had just made an enemy who would enjoy the fight far more than he let on, and that he would be, for exactly that reason, very dangerous indeed. The obstacle, when it finally declared itself, did so at dinner, in front of 30 people, with the particular gentleness of a knife going in below the ribs, where it will not be noticed until the guest has already stood to leave. It was Edmund who raised the subject, rising with his glass half lifted, as though the thought had only just occurred to him, though Eleanor would come to learn that nothing Edmund said in company had only just occurred to him. He proposed, for the comfort of the family and the county both, that Julian and his lady might consent to be married a second time, quietly, properly, by special licence, with witnesses enough to satisfy the most exacting bishop in England, so that no one, he said, looking round the table with an expression of pure benevolent concern, need ever again wonder what precisely had been said in a burning chapel by a dying man. He called it a kindness. He called it, twice, a small thing, easily done, costing nothing but an afternoon and a licence fee, and Eleanor watched 3/4 of the table nod at the good sense of it before she had found the words to answer. It was the dowager who answered for her, in effect by saying that she thought it an excellent notion, and that the sooner done the better. For everyone's peace, and Eleanor understood in that single sentence exactly what the small kindness would cost her, because a second marriage, however quietly done, was itself a confession that the first had never quite been one, and a confession, once made in front of 30 witnesses, could never afterward be taken back, regardless of what any register anywhere might say. She said, when she trusted her voice, that she had been married once already, and had not yet worn out the wedding, and there was a ripple of laughter that saved her, though she felt Julian's hand close hard over hers under the table, and she could not tell whether it was in support or in warning. Afterward, in the corridor, Julian caught her by the wrist, not roughly, and asked her, low, whether she understood what Edmund was building, brick by pleasant brick, and she said that she understood it a good deal better than he seemed to think, because she had grown up in a shop where men tried to talk her father down on a fair price by calling it a kindness to both of them, and she knew the shape of the sentence when she heard it wherever it was spoken. He looked at her a long moment, surprised, and something in his face eased that had not eased since the fire. "You are the only person in this house," he said, "who has said a true thing to me since we arrived." She did not tell him, that night, about the glass of amber wine at the west window, nor about what Edmund had said standing beside her, because she had not yet decided whether keeping it to herself was loyalty to her husband, or the first small brick of her own wall, and she lay a long time turning that question the way she turned the bone folder, without arriving anywhere. It was 2 days later that she went down before dawn, unable to sleep in a house still full of strangers, and found her way to the old estate library, and further in, to the disused still-room off it that some earlier duchess had once used for pressing flowers, and that now stood empty enough to serve, she saw at once as a passable bindery. There were tools there gone to rust, a press with its screw seized, and she stood among them a long while, with her own bone-folder in her hand, and felt, for the first time since the fire, something like the ground under her feet. It was there that the housekeeper found her, an older woman named Mrs. Prue, who ran Aldermere the way Eleanor's father had once run his shop, with an economy of words and none at all wasted on flattery, and who looked at the Duchess of Aldermere on her knees before a rusted press at 5 in the morning, and said only that she supposed her Grace would be wanting oil and a rag, then, and went to fetch them without being asked twice. It was the first unhesitating kindness anyone in that house had shown her, and Eleanor would remember it long after she had forgotten the words of Edmund's toast, because it cost the housekeeper nothing to offer, and everything, in a house so carefully watching which way the wind blew, to offer without waiting to see which way it went first. Working the oil into the press screw with her own hands, in her own borrowed dress, in a room nobody powerful cared to enter, Eleanor said aloud to no one in particular that she would not be married twice to satisfy people who had not troubled to attend the wedding they already doubted, and Mrs. Prue, wringing out a rag by the door, said only that it was a fine thing to hear a duchess with an opinion of her own. More of them ought to try it, and went on with her work as though she had not just told Eleanor the truest thing anyone in the house had said to her yet. The first long quiet between Eleanor and Julian came a fortnight later, on an evening when the heat had not broken in 3 weeks, and the whole county lay under it like a held breath, and it began, as these things do, with a question she had not meant to ask so plainly. She asked him why he had married her the day he did. In the chapel he did, rather than waiting even a week for a licence and a witness list that could not be argued with afterward, and he was a long time answering, turning the ring on his smallest finger the whole while, so that she said, before he had found his words, that she would rather have the truth turned slowly than a kindness turned quickly. He told her then, in full, what she had only had in pieces before. His father had been dying through that whole spring, faster than anyone outside the house knew, and the old man's dearest fear, voiced to Julian alone in the last clear week he had, was not death itself, but the estate falling to Edmund, whom he had never trusted, a fear Julian did not fully share, but could not in conscience dismiss from a dying man. An heir, married before his father's death, settled the question beyond any cousin's reach, or so the old duke believed, and Julian, watching his father fail by the day, had ridden out that very evening meaning only to call at the vicarage on some other errand, and had instead found Eleanor in the yard behind her father's shop, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and glue on her hands, arguing with a carter over a delivery of hide that had come in wet, and had stood and watched her win the argument before he ever said a word to her at all. "I did not marry you for my father," he said. "I married you because I watched you settle an account with a man twice your size, using nothing but arithmetic and a flat refusal to be talked round. And I thought, there, that is a woman who will still be exactly herself in 20 years, and I wanted to be married to that, whatever the register said, or didn't." It was the longest true thing he had said to her since the wedding, and she sat with it a while before she answered, because it deserved to be sat with. Then she told him her side of it, which he had not fully heard either, how her father had warned her, the very night before the fire, that a duke's attention was a fine thing to receive, and a hard thing to keep, how she had married him half from wanting him, and half from a girl's plain terror of losing the only interesting thing that had ever happened to her, and how she had spent every day since arriving at Aldermere waiting for someone to tell her the whole arrangement had been a mistake after. All. You can afford to say the register doesn't matter, she told him, because whatever it says, you remain the Duke of Aldermere. I am only the Duchess if it says so. That is the whole of the difference between us, and it is not a small one. He had no answer for that, which she respected more than a false one, and they sat a long while in the heat, with the window open and no air moving through it at all, until a servant knocked to say that the bishop's clerk had arrived from Ray with a letter requiring an answer that night, and the ordinary spell of the evening broke the way a held breath finally breaks. The letter, when Julian read it aloud to her, informed them with careful ecclesiastical courtesy that the bishop, having been petitioned by more than one party regarding the circumstances of the marriage, felt himself obliged to open a formal inquiry into its validity, to be conducted with all discretion and concluded, he hoped, within the season, and that he would be grateful if both parties would hold themselves available to answer such questions as his examiners might raise. Julian set the letter down very carefully, as a man sets down something he would rather have thrown, and said that he would write back tonight refusing the whole business as an insult, and it was Eleanor, to her own surprise, who told him not to. "Let them look," she said. "I would rather be examined and cleared than protected and doubted for the rest of my life," and she said it not knowing yet what the looking would cost her, only that refusing to be looked at had never once, in her whole life, made anyone stop wondering what there was to hide. Her father came up from Cutler's Row at the end of that same week, summoned on the pretext of rebinding a set of estate ledgers that genuinely did want mending, though Eleanor suspected rightly that Julian had also simply wanted her to have one person in the house who had known her before any of this began. Josiah Hartwell arrived smelling of the road, and underneath it, of the shop itself, glue and leather and lamp oil, a smell Eleanor had not known she'd missed until it walked in the door, and undid something in her chest all at once. He looked at his daughter a long moment in the front hall, took in the dress, the room, the footman standing at careful attention, and said only that she had grown taller, which was not true, and which they both understood to mean something else entirely. Working beside him in the old still-room that had become her bindery, sleeves rolled, the two of them elbow to elbow over a ledger with a cracked spine, Eleanor felt more herself than she had in a month. It was there, well into the second afternoon, that her father mentioned, without any particular weight, that he had done a job for the parish the very week of the fire, rebinding what remained of St. Ione's register book, salvaged half-burnt by old Elder Pruitt the sexton before the roof came down. A sorry business, most of the pages scorched past saving, though he had done what any binder does with a damaged book, used what waste paper he had to hand to line the new spine, and keep what pages remained from tearing further at the fold. He said it exactly the way he might have said he'd mended a boot, and went on at once to some complaint about the quality of thread being sold in London these days, and it was only a full minute later that Eleanor set down her own needle and asked him, very carefully, what waste paper he had used. Whatever was to hand, he said, a binder does not waste good scrap, you know that better than most, and some of what came out of that chapel with Pruitt was charred at the edges, but whole enough in the middle to serve as lining. No different from any old ledger page, bought by the pound from a stationer's floor. He looked up and saw her face, and stopped. "What is it?" he said, and she told him, slowly, that the register in question was the very book the bishop's inquiry now wanted more than any other object in England, and that if any page from the night of her own marriage had survived the fire only to be sewn invisibly into a spine as scrap lining, it was sitting somewhere at this moment, unread, inside a binding nobody had any reason to open. Her father sat very still at that, turning it over the way he turned every problem, methodically, without hurry, and then he said the things she would carry with her the rest of her life, the things she would hear quoted back to her twice more before the year was out from mouths she did not expect. A binding does not make a book true, he said. It only keeps it whole long enough to be read. If your marriage is written somewhere in that spine, girl, it was already true the day the ink dried. The binding only decides whether anyone after us gets to find it out. She asked him where the book was now, and he said he did not know. He had delivered it back to Elder Pruitt the week after the fire, and had heard nothing of it since, though he supposed, given the inquiry. It must by now be somewhere in the bishop's own keeping, sealed away as evidence of a marriage nobody could prove, and nobody could quite disprove either. That night Eleanor did not sleep at all. She lay with the bone folder turning in her hand in the dark, thinking of 40 years of her father's scrap lining, and of one particular scrap that might, if she was right, be lying folded and silent no more than an hour's ride away, waiting for someone who knew how to open a book without destroying what it held. In the morning she told Julian only that she meant to call on the bishop's archive on a pretext of her own devising, and when he asked what pretext, she said that she had not decided yet, but that, whatever it was, it would have to be good enough to get a bookbinder's daughter alone, in a room with a damaged register and nobody watching her hands too closely. The pretext, in the end, was supplied by Aaron Fenwick, who had grown from the boy who once carried Eleanor's father's deliveries into a stationer with his own small custom, supplying paper and thread to half the parish offices in the diocese, the bishop's library among them. He came to Aldermere at Josiah's asking, and stood in the hall turning his hat in his hands with the particular awkwardness of a man greeting a woman he had once hoped to marry now, that she outranked him by a distance neither of them could measure, and Eleanor crossed the room and took both his hands before he could decide whether a bow was owed, which settled the matter for him more kindly than any words could have. He listened to what she needed and did not hesitate. He had, he said, a standing order to inspect and resupply the diocesan bindery twice a year, and nothing prevented him bringing an assistant, and if that assistant happened to be a duchess in a plain grey travelling dress and no coronet in sight, well, bishops' clerks were not in the habit of examining a stationer's help too closely. It was, Eleanor thought, exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous nobility the profile of a man like Aaron never seemed to earn credit for, offering his own good name and his own livelihood to a woman who had chosen someone else, without one word of complaint or claim on her for it. They travelled to Ray together 3 days later, and it was in the corridor outside the bishop's own library, waiting for the archivist to be called away on some other errand Aaron had cleverly arranged, that they came face to face with Edmund Vane, who had, it seemed, business of his own at the palace that week, and who looked at the two of them standing together with an expression that took a full second longer than it should have to arrange itself into pleasant surprise. "Cousin," he said, "what an unlikely place to find you among the parish accounts," and Eleanor said that she had always found accounts a comfortable place to be found, having grown up keeping them, and he smiled at that, the smile arriving a half-second before it reached his eyes, the way it always did. He did not leave. He walked with them, unhurried, all the way to the library door, talking pleasantly of nothing, and at the threshold he said, with the same warm reasonableness he had used at every dinner-table since her arrival, that he did hope she understood none of this was personal, that a great house was, in the end, only a kind of accounting itself, and that blood kept its own accounts, whatever a person's private virtues might be. "I am not cruel," he said. "I am arithmetical, which the young always mistake for cruelty." She told him that she had also grown up keeping accounts, and that in her experience the men who called themselves arithmetical were usually the ones most afraid of an honest audit, and left him standing in the corridor with that to consider while she went in to the register book at last. It lay on the archivist's table exactly as her father had described it, rebound in plain calf, the front boards still faintly smoke-stained at one corner, and when she opened it and ran her thumb along the inside of the new spine, she felt, before she saw, the particular double thickness of a lining that had been built up from more than one sheet, a binder's trick she knew in her own fingers the way another woman might know a piece of her own embroidery blind. Her father's stitches, small and even, 41 to the hand's span, ran down the gutter exactly where he always set them, and beneath the outer lining sheet. Visible only as the faintest ridge under her thumbnail, lay a second paper, folded in, older, its edge just proud enough of the new lining to catch a fingernail if a person knew exactly where to feel for it. She sat a long moment with her hand resting flat on the open book, Aaron keeping careful watch at the door, and understood that she had found, in the last place anyone had thought to look, the one paper that could answer the whole of the bishop's inquiry, if only she dared to cut it free. She did not cut it free that day. She was too careful a binder's daughter for that, and too aware of whose property lay open beneath her hands, and so she went instead to the archivist himself, a dry, precise man named Mr. Prynne, who had spent 40 years among diocesan papers and took more pride in his stitching than in his opinions, and told him plainly what she believed the lining held, and why, and asked that the unpicking be done properly, by 2 pairs of trained hands, with a witness present who owed nothing to either side of the family. He was, to her relief, more interested in the binding than in the scandal, and agreed at once on condition the bishop himself be sent for to attend, which was exactly the condition Eleanor had hoped for and had not quite dared to ask outright. The bishop came within the hour, a heavy, careful old man named Alaric Marsh, who had christened half the county and buried the other half, and had, until that week, regarded the whole Aldermere business as a tedious social quarrel, dressed up as a canonical one, beneath his real attention. He stood at Mr. Prynne's shoulder as the archivist worked a fine blade under 40 small stitches. One at a time, Eleanor's own hands folded hard in her lap the whole while, because it was not, in the end, hers to do, and when the lining lifted free at last, and the second sheet came away whole, singed along one edge but legible entire across the middle, the room went very quiet. Mr. Prynne read it through once to himself before he would read it aloud, and then he read it aloud, slowly, in the flat official voice of a man reading something he means to be believed precisely because he adds nothing of his own feeling to it. It was the marriage entry entire, dated, the vicar's own hand, 2 witnesses named, one of them Elder Pruitt himself, still living, still able to swear to it. The bishop said nothing for a long moment, and then he said, to no one in particular, that he would need Pruitt sent for within the week, and that he was obliged to say the matter looked on its face a good deal more settled than he had been given to understand it was. It was in that same moment, while the ink still lay open on the table, and before either of them had thought to send word to Julian, that the library door opened without a knock, and Edmund Vane stood in it, having plainly not been far off the whole while, and took in the open book, the singed paper, the bishop's face, in one long, unhurried look. He said, quite calmly, that he wondered how convenient it was that her Grace should have discovered, alone, with only a stationer for a witness, precisely the paper the whole county had been waiting a year to find, and that a man might almost admire the neatness of it, if he did not also find himself wondering how such a paper came to be so easily produced by a woman whose own father had bound the book in question. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The accusation sat in the room exactly where he had set it, and Eleanor felt, for one long terrible second, the whole of the last hour's triumph curdle into something that looked, to any eye that wanted it to, exactly like a forgery caught in the act, her own hand still resting on the table not 2 inches from the paper, her own father's stitching undone by her own fingers, and no one in the room but Aaron and Mr. Prynne to say otherwise. The bishop's face, which had softened toward her not 5 minutes before, closed over again like a shutter, and he said, heavily, that the matter would now have to be examined a good deal more carefully than he had first supposed, and that until it was, the book and the paper both would be sealed under his own hand, and no one, he looked at Eleanor as he said it, no one at all would be permitted near either again without his express leave. She left the palace at Ray that evening with Aaron silent and furious beside her in the chaise, and understood, watching the spire of the cathedral fall away behind them into the dusk, that she had handed her enemy, without meaning to, the one weapon that could undo everything her own hands had just uncovered. The quiet ending was offered to her 4 days later, in the small parlour at Eldermere, by the Dowager herself, who came to it with none of Edmund's warmth and all of his precision, which Eleanor found in its way more honest. The old woman proposed, without preamble, that Eleanor withdraw to the Dower House for a time, perhaps a season, perhaps longer, that the inquiry be allowed to conclude quietly in her absence, that whatever the paper said or did not say might be settled among lawyers and bishops without a duchess standing in the room to be doubted while it was decided, and that a generous settlement would of course be made, sufficient to keep her father's shop in comfort for the rest of his days. It was, the Dowager said, the kindest thing that could be done for everyone, Julian most of all, who could not be seen fighting his own family in public over a woman half the county already whispered about. Eleanor said no. She said it plainly once, the way her father set down a tool he had finished with, and then she explained herself, because the Dowager was owed an explanation, even if she was not owed obedience. I would rather be known and doubted, Eleanor said, than hidden and safe. You are asking me to disappear so that other people may decide in comfort what is true about a marriage I was standing inside of when it happened. I will not do it. Whatever this house decides about me, it will decide it with me in the room. The Dowager looked at her a long moment with something that was not quite respect, and not quite its opposite, and said only that she had expected as much, and left it there. It was Julian, that same evening, who did the greater harm, meaning the greater kindness. He came to her with Edmund's accusation weighing visibly on him, and the bishop's cold letter, and a lawyer's warning that any further contact between Eleanor and the sealed evidence could be read as tampering, and he told her, gently, holding both her hands, that he thought it best, only for a time, only until the inquiry concluded, that she remove herself to the Dower House after all, out of the reach of anything Edmund might yet contrive against her. He said it as protection. She heard it as verdict. She asked him, very quietly, whether he believed her, and he said of course, without a heartbeat's hesitation, but she had already seen his thumb find the signet ring and turn it once, the old tell she had learned in the first week of her marriage, and she could not, that night, make herself believe the turning meant nothing. She went to the dower house the next morning without another word of argument, because arguing would have meant staying to be managed, and she would not be managed even by a man she loved. She took the bone folder and little else. The house was small and plain and smelled of dust sheets, and she sat that first evening at its narrow window, while a storm that had been building all week finally broke over the county, rain coming down in long grey ropes over fields gone dry as paper, and watched, through the water on the glass, the black finger of St. Ione's spire disappear entirely into the weather. She did not weep, because weeping was a thing she had never much had time for, but she sat a long while with her hand around the bone folder and thought that she had been sent away exactly the way a damaged page is set aside from a book, for its own protection. Everyone said, and a page set aside long enough forgets it was ever meant to be read at all. It was near midnight, with the storm still going, that she made up her mind. She would not wait to be cleared by other people's caution. She would write to the bishop herself plainly, and ask him to come to Aldermere and hear the whole matter out in the open, before every witness who mattered, rather than behind sealed doors where a frightened old man's discretion could be quietly turned, brick by pleasant brick, into Edmund's favour. The bishop came in the end, not for her letter alone, but because Mr. Prynne had, in the intervening week, done what careful men do when accused of carelessness, and had the singed paper examined independently by two hands neither family could claim as its own. An ink specialist from the cathedral chapter, and an old binder from the next county over who had trained, as it happened, under the very man who had taught Josiah Hartwell his trade 40 years before, and both had sworn, separately, that the ink and the parchment were of an age with the fire, and not 1 week younger, and that the stitching which had concealed the page bore every mark of having been sewn in at the time of the original binding, and not since disturbed until Mr. Prynne's own blade had opened it under witness. It was this, more than any word of Eleanor's, that turned the bishop's caution, though she would never know exactly how much of his change of heart was evidence, and how much was the plain fact of an old man discovering he had very nearly let his own timidity be used as a weapon against a woman who had done nothing but tell the truth too soon for anyone's comfort. The great dinner that followed was called ostensibly to mark the season's end, but everyone under that roof understood it for what it was, the last public reckoning of the whole business, and the dowager, presiding still over her own table, as she had presided over every table for 40 years, had arranged the seating and the order of the evening with the same careful hand she brought to. Everything. Which meant that when the steward came at last to propose the health of the house, he lifted his glass to the Duke of Aldermere alone, by long custom, and by careful instruction both, and the whole long table rose and drank to Julian's name, 30 glasses catching the candlelight at once, and did not so much as glance toward the woman seated at his right hand. The table drank the Duke's health and skipped his wife, and the silence that followed the swallowing was the loudest sound Eleanor had heard in her whole year at Aldermere. She sat very still, the bone folder cold in her closed hand under the cloth, and did not trust her face to hold steady a moment longer, and it was into that silence, before she had to find out whether it would hold or break, that Bishop Marsh rose from his own chair at the table's foot, unhurried, heavy, entirely deliberate, and lifted his own glass alone. To Eleanor, Duchess of Aldermere, he said, and the room went entirely still around the words, married in the sight of God at St. Ione's, on the night it burned, by a paper this week proved true under my own hand, and 2 others besides. And I will hear no more said in my diocese against it. He drank alone. No one else at that table had lifted a glass with him, and for one suspended second it seemed the whole room might simply let the moment pass, before Julian rose beside her, his chair scraping loud in the quiet, and lifted his own glass to match the bishop's, and said her name, and no title at all, only her name, which undid her far more than the bishop's had. It was Edmund who broke first. He came up out of his chair with a speed that startled the whole table, reaching not for a glass but for the register itself, which Mr. Prynne had set upon the sideboard for exactly this evening, meaning to snatch it toward the nearest candle before anyone understood what he meant to do with it. And it was Aaron, quickest to his feet of anyone in the room, who caught his wrist before the paper ever touched the flame. In the scuffle, Edmund's own words came out of him faster than his composure could catch them, that the book should have burned entire the first time, that he had paid old Pruitt well enough to say it had, that a dying vicar's scrawl should never have been left to outlive better men's arithmetic, and every word of it landed in a room full of witnesses who had, until that instant, still half believed him the reasonable one. He stood a moment after, breathing hard, the candle unlit, the paper safe in Mr. Prynne's hand, and something went out of his face that Eleanor had never seen leave it before, the smile arriving late this time and not at all, and he said, quietly, to the room rather than to any one person in it, that he supposed the accounts had been audited after all, and bowed, once, with what remained of his dignity, and walked out of the hall without waiting to be asked to. The room emptied slowly after that, in the particular hush of people who have watched something irreversible happen, and do not yet trust themselves to speak of it aloud, and it was very late before Eleanor found herself alone with Julian in the long gallery where she had first stood looking at the burned spire a year before. He took her hand and turned it over and set the bone folder, still warm from her own grip, gently back into her palm, having taken it from her without her quite noticing during the worst of the scuffle, to keep it from being crushed underfoot, he said. And she found that small, unthinking care undid her more than the whole evening's vindication had. She told him then plainly what the Dower House had cost her, that being sent away for her own protection had felt exactly like being believed guilty, and he said that he understood that now, too late to spare her the season of it, and that he had been so afraid of losing the fight to Edmund's patience that he had forgotten a woman does not want to be protected from a battle so much as fought. Beside in it, she said she forgave him, and found, saying it, that she meant it, though she told him plainly there were terms she would not soften even for a reconciliation this sweet. She would keep her bindery, the still-room and the press, and the smell of glue that was hers before it was ever his, and no one in that house would suggest again that a duchess's hands ought to be idle. Her father's name would go properly into the parish record beside the vicar's and the witnesses', craftsman and rescuer both, not a servant's footnote. Edmund would not be destroyed, whatever the room that night might have wished on him, but exiled honourably to the smaller estate in the north, with an allowance and a warning, allowed to keep his name and his dignity, because ruining him utterly would only teach the county that mercy was for the powerful alone. And she would never again be asked to leave a room, a house, a fight, for her own good, without being asked first whether she wished to go. Julian agreed to every term before she had finished naming the last of them, which she took, rightly, as the truest proof yet that he had heard her. Old Pruitt, brought before the bishop within the week exactly as promised, confirmed the marriage entire under oath, weeping a little as he did it, and confessed that Edmund's money had bought only his silence, never his memory, which had kept the truth whole in him the whole year, through the way her father's stitches had kept it whole in the spine. There was, in the spring that followed, a proper blessing at the rebuilt chapel of St. Ione's, its spire scaffolded through the winter, and rung again for the first time on the morning of the service, not a second marriage. Eleanor had been firm on that point. But a thanksgiving, the whole county in attendance this time, the dowager included, who said not one word of apology, but who took Eleanor's hand at the door of the church, and held it a moment longer than courtesy required, which both women understood well enough to mean the same thing. A year and 11 days from the night of the fire, on a bright ordinary morning, with the smell of box hedge coming in at the open window, and no smoke in it anywhere, Eleanor sat again at the Aldermere breakfast table, with her own small daughter on her knee, the child's fat fist closed around the very same bone folder, worn now to an even gentler colour than before, tracing the scratched H with one curious finger, while the footman, who had learned long since exactly how to address every person at that table, set down her Grace's cup first, as was proper. And the household's health was drunk each morning now the same way, all together, no one skipped, no one forgotten. And Julian caught Eleanor's eye across the marmalade, and turned his ring once, not to hide anything this time, only from habit, and she reached across and stilled his hand with her own, and neither of them said a word, because by then neither of them needed to. If this house and this table, and the long year it took to fill every chair at it fairly, kept you close tonight, stay by the fire a little longer before you go. I think often of Josiah Hartwell's plain little truth about bindings and books, and of how long a good thing can wait, whole and unread, for someone patient enough to find it, and I'd love to know which page of this one held you fastest, so tell me in the comments where you sat with Eleanor a while. If Dr. Channel _name Egears has become one of your fireside stops, consider staying a subscriber to it, so the next story finds you the moment it's lit. The kettle's still warm, and there's another tale waiting just past the door. Sleep gently tonight, and be kind to whoever sits across your own table tomorrow.